Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Genealogical History of the Persianate World International Symposium. I'm Joanne Gross, Professor of Middle Eastern and Central Asian Studies of History at the College of New Jersey and visiting research collaborator at the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. It has been a long time in coming. With our originally scheduled spring 2020 symposium having to be canceled, but we are all here, healthy, albeit still living in an alternate pandemic reality, and gathered here for the next 3 half days to discuss the subject of genealogical history. The symposium takes as its premise that the culture and construction of genealogical documentation in the Persianate world merits new consideration as a field of study. And I think it will be clear as we progress through our presentations and discussions that those of us working on this genre are breaking new ground with regard to the questions we ask, the sources we use, the conclusions we formulate, and the methodologies we adopt. We are also considering the Persianate in the broadest sense of the term, exploring translocality, narratives of origin, documentary culture and Islamization, genealogy as discourse and practice, and Sufism and genealogy. I would like to acknowledge a number of people and institutions that have supported the Badakhshan Genealogical Project and that have made this symposium possible as the capstone of our project. First, the National Endowment of Humanities, which awarded me with a 3-year collaborative grant with my 2 colleagues, Daniel Beben and Omed Mamad-Cherzochoyev, Dr. Dean Wong, the Dean of the School of my home institution, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, whose support throughout the many years of this project's development, including co-sponsorship of today's symposium, has been unwavering. Also at TCNJ, I would like to acknowledge the support of Vice President and Provost Jeffrey Osborne, Anne-Marie Maratia, Management Assistant in the Dean's Office, and an essential source of support for the efficient running of our grant. Professor Behruz Gamadi Tabrizi, Director of the Bijan and Sharmin Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, which has become my second home, and is co-sponsor of the symposium. His strong support in a greatly stimulating environment that he has created despite COVID has been essential really to the success of my work. Also at the center, Becky Parnion, events coordinator, who has worked tirelessly on the organizational details of this event, and Femke de Reuter, our center manager, Regan Maragi, former center manager when I began the project. And I would also like to acknowledge the former acting directors at the center, Professor John Holden and Professor Kevin Harris, who saw the value in my work when it was in its earliest stages of infancy. At Princeton University Library, I would like to acknowledge Dr. David Magier, Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Collections and Research Services, without whose support the digitalization project would never have gotten off the ground, as well as Dr. Joyce Bell, Roel Munoz, Kim Lehman, Pavel Angelos, and Jennifer Maxmeyer. And finally, not lastly though, the members of the project's advisory board, many of whom are here today, and Pete Nowak, who is our IT support person, who is with us today, making sure that everything works out as we intended. I'm just going to go over a few brief organizational details before introducing other people who are going to be part of the welcome. Daniel Beben and I will be taking turns introducing the sessions and the papers, and discussants will be moderating the Q&A. The first 10 minutes of discussion will be allotted for the participants of the symposium, who will either use the raise hand button or the chat button, where it's possible to write out your questions. And 10 minutes will be allotted to invited guests who will use the Q&A button to write questions. Discussants will also be keeping time for the presenters, and we're going to be strict about the time, so please be sure to give reminders. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jane Wong, Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at the College of New Jersey.
Thank you, Professor Gross, for that warm introduction, and greetings to all symposium attendees. As Dr. Gross said, I am Dr. Jane Wong, Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the College of New Jersey, fondly referred to as TCNJ. It's my distinct pleasure to honor and welcome each of you to our college, although we cannot meet in person. The heart of our School of Humanities and Social Sciences scholarly community is the human story. We study its many dimensions across an exciting array of liberal arts disciplines, across time, place, and modalities of exploration. This international symposium examining genealogical history in the Persianate world brings to us an oft-neglected part of that complex human story. Thank you to each of the scholars who will be enriching our understanding of this part of our story. I particularly thank TCNJ's Dr. Joanne Gross, Dr. Daniel Beben of Nazarbayev University, and the director of the Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University, Dr. Benruz Gamari Chabrizi, for organizing and convening this event. I am grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities for making the symposium possible through a major grant to Professor Gross to work with her two principal collaborators, Daniel Beben and Umed Mossavar-Rahmani of the Academy of Sciences in the Republic of Tajikistan. If I may take a moment as a proud dean to boast about Dr. Joanne Gross. She has served the College of New Jersey faithfully for 33 years as a professor of Middle Eastern and Central Eurasian history. She helped us maintain and create interconnections between Inner Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Iran, and the Arab region at TCNJ through active work in hiring, course development, study abroad, her Iran and Beyond Title VI Award, and her Silk Road summer study tours. So impressive for a primarily undergraduate institution. Dr. Gross, our students are the beneficiaries of your scholarship and teaching. So thank you for the gift of your scholarship and teaching. We are privileged that her work has been recognized by the Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University, where she has been a research collaborator, connecting us with our colleagues just a stone's throw away. Thank you all for your quest for knowledge and for sharing your discoveries with the world. In the words of the National Endowment for the Humanities, democracy demands wisdom. Best wishes for an invigorating and enlightening symposium.
Thank you so much, Dean Wong, and for your very generous words. I'm now happy to introduce Professor Behruz Ramadi Tabrizi, Director of the Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies and Professor of Near Eastern Studies.
Thank you so much, Professor Gross, or as we know you as Joanne. and it's such a distinct pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this symposium. And it's truly a disappointment that we can't have all of you here with us and have this conversation in person. we were planning to make that happen last year, and it was such a difficult decision to decide to cancel the event last year. But I'm so glad, with really tireless work of Professor Gross and her collaborators, Daniel Beben and all the members of the faculty in Tajikistan, in Kazakhstan, and all other interlocutors, and all the people who opened their door to the researchers. And in the next couple of days, you hear and see a treasure trove of documents and the kind of work that everyone involved in this project has done. And we are extremely fortunate that we had the opportunity to facilitate this endeavor and make it possible for people today from all around the world, from Tokyo, from Vienna, from Bonn, from Astana, from Tajikistan, for everywhere that people were interested in this project and had spent years of conducting incredible research, truly, I could say a historical ethnography from history from bottom up and history from below. And this is quite an amazing project, and I just wish all of you two productive days, and I hope that the Zoom fatigue would not take over, and I am sure that in this case that will not be true, because of the incredible creativity that has gone into these projects. And I would like also to thank Dean Wong for also their support from our own neighborhood here, and enjoy the conference. And thank you, Joanne, for including us in this project. And it's been a really true pleasure for us to be a part of this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Daniel Beben, Assistant Professor of History and Religious Studies at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. And he will be sharing some framing comments for the symposium. Daniel?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, depending on where you're joining us from. First of all, I really want to thank Joanne and Umid for inviting me to be a part of this project. It has been a great experience for me, and I look forward to our continued collaboration. I want to thank Dean Wong and Professor Kavan Tabrizi for your support of this event, and to all our colleagues here for joining us. What I want to just briefly discuss here is to share a few words about what I see as the significance of this event, and to talk a little bit about what we see coming out of this event moving forward. Now, one of the major questions that we have grappled with in our work on the Politic Manuscripts project is trying to determine what are the models, the sources of inspiration for these documents that we are working with here. What are some of the broader currents of genres of documentation that has inspired these, and that we can contextualize them within? And in trying to determine this, it's been a bit difficult, because there is a real lack of research that has been done on this topic previously. Much of the research that has been done by people sitting here in this room, so to speak. So I would say, first and foremost, one of our more selfish objectives, perhaps, in organizing the symposium is to use this as an opportunity to gather together some comparative research on these topics that will help us to contextualize our findings from this project. But of course, we have some broader objectives here as well. I think our biggest hope coming out of this conference, which really is a landmark event in many respects, really the first event of its kind, not only for its focus on genealogy, but for its focus on the Persianate context, which is something that is too often overlooked, I think, in the way that many of our institutions tend to divide up regions on the basis of supposed area studies. I think that the broadest objective that we have here is to hope that this conversation will continue, that our discussion here will form sort of a nucleus of a community of scholars that will continue to remain engaged, support each other in dealing with this area of research, which is very, very new, a very novel area of research. And a lot of questions, new approaches that are developing in terms of methodologies and theories that can help us to understand how to interpret and utilize these documents as sources for answering various questions. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other in that regard. And again, as a forum to continue to support each other moving forward in this work. I also want to call attention here to some particular aspects of the type of sources that we are discussing here in this conference today and in our research. These are in many cases documents that are coming from local private collections, from local family sources. Oh, my lights just went out here mysteriously. From collections that often are not served by institutional archives, and which in many cases are very direly in need of preservation and of some sort of institutional support. One of the things we have been able to accomplish here in this project is to, again, to create a permanent digital archive that is now housed through the Princeton University Library. Jan will be discussing this a bit in our first panel moving forward. And I do want to call attention to the fact that there are funding sources available for this type of work moving forward. The NEH obviously is one major source of support. The British Library offers grants. There are other various types of funding sources as well. So for any of those of you who may be thinking about future research projects, this is something that we have found very rewarding, very productive, has enabled us to work with many of these local communities within the Pamirs in Afghanistan and elsewhere, as a way of developing those connections and helping to preserve a lot of these local materials. In our work, we have benefited a great deal from people who have done projects like this before, especially from our colleagues that worked on the Zaidi manuscript project in Yemen, who have advised us in other similar projects. And of course, for any others who are looking to do feature work in this area, we are at your disposal to provide some advice on moving forward with that. So these are some things that we hope will come out of this convention here, the symposium. In terms of publishing outputs, my colleagues Joanne, Umid, and I will be working on a co-authored book based on our work from the Balakshan Manuscripts Project. You'll be hearing a bit more about that in our first panel today. And then, of course, as we have mentioned in our previous correspondence, we are planning to produce an edited volume that will be based on the papers and, from the symposium. Joanne, I believe, is going to speak more about this on the final day of our symposium, a little more about that. So we have a number of things that we envision coming out of this event. Of course, if any of you have other publications related to your current projects or topics related to the symposium, we hope that you will stay in touch and share those with us. One of the things I was thinking about moving forward was developing some type of online database, perhaps to stay abreast with current research in this area, where we can maintain a bibliography of publications and whatnot. So we hope that you will keep us informed of any work that you are doing in this area. I want to make a special plug here for the work of the Association for the Study of Persianate Societies, which many of us here are already involved with. We publish a journal, we hold a biannual convention, which we're hoping to resume as soon as global circumstances permit. And I think this might be one forum moving forward where we can continue some of these conversations and continue this work. Joanne already made some notes about the logistics of how the panels will run moving forward. I do just want to reiterate that we are going to be very strict on timekeeping here. We are cognizant of the fact that Zoom fatigue is a real thing, so we don't want to maintain you any longer than we need to. This is really all I had to add here. I had planned to keep my remarks short in case my predecessors decide to say more, but I think what we can do here perhaps is just wrap things up a little bit early with our welcoming remarks and give you all some time to prepare for our first session, which will be beginning at 10 a.m. there, Eastern Standard Time. So I think before we proceed, does anyone have any questions about anything about the logistics of how we will proceed here, or more generally about the symposium, anything related to that? No questions, okay. Going into my teaching mode here. Well, of course, if you do have any questions over the next 30 or 40 minutes, you're welcome to email Joanne or I, and we will try to make sure that we are able to respond before our first session begins. As she mentions, she and I will be doing the introductions, taking turns offering the introductions for the panels. We are asking the discussants to please make sure to keep time and to please be vigilant about that. And again, I just want to remind you, we will be first taking questions after the discussants' comments. We'll first be taking questions from the symposium participants. You can either use the raise your hand function within Zoom or type it into the chat and the discussant will read it aloud. And then after 20 minutes dedicated for participant questions, we will move on to questions from our broader body of invited guests here that will be joining us as well. So that concludes what I had. Joanne, did you want to add anything?
I see Mana has a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I probably should have asked this yesterday. Have the papers been circulated to the attendees? I mean, I know they have to the panelists.
No, not to the attendees.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, very much for offering these framing comments and some key issues that we want to address in terms of the organization. So we do have a generous break before the 10 o'clock session begins. And I'd like to, for those of you who would like, those of us participants who would like to have conversations, I believe that the windows will be open for us. And so, feel free to start a conversation, or I don't know if we have the option of actually even going in a breakout room at some point. Those of you who would like to gather, particularly with one or another as participant. But in any case, we will reconvene after the break and start promptly at 10 o'clock for the first session of the day. The first and only session of the day. Thank you.
Just a reminder to the folks who are the attendees and our panelists, the chat will be open for our break duration, and please feel free to keep your camera on as well so our audience can interact with you.
Thank you, Pete.
Okay, Joanne, should I go ahead and start?
What's that?
Should I go ahead and get started?
I'm going to introduce the panel. You want to?
Okay. No, sure, you can go ahead.
But are we on? I mean,
It's 10 o'clock, so yeah, I think we're ready.
Well, at least it's not being recorded. So I think you have to wait for Pete, no?
okay, thank you.
We're all set, Joanne.
So should I start talking now?
You can begin.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone. And welcome to today's panel, which is devoted to research connected to the Badakhshan genealogical project from which this symposium stems. The first paper is my own, titled Perspectives on Digitizing, Archiving, and Historicizing the Ismaili Nasabnoma Tradition. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I will begin with some remarks on how I came to focus my research on the culture of genealogical documentation in Badakhshan and the impetus behind my efforts to create a digital archive of nasabnomas from the Pamir in Princeton University Library's digital repository. I will then discuss one of the nasabnomas in the collection as a case study, and that is of the foundational figure Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani, or as he's popularly known, Shah, to discuss the genre as a non-state familial documentary practice or a site of knowledge production, to use the words of Anna Laura Stoller, and a legitimizing construction of Islamic sanctification and Sayyid Imami legitimacy. In 2003, I shifted the geographical setting of my research on Sufism and shrine culture from Uzbekistan, where I had conducted research between 1979 and 2002, mainly in the Institute of Oriental Studies manuscript collection and in the document collection of the State Archives in Tashkent. I shifted to Tajikistan, where this topic was relatively uncharted in the early post-Soviet years and in the aftermath of the bloody 1992 to 1997 Tajik Civil War. Whereas ethnographic field research by Western scholars was severely limited in Soviet Central Asia, in Tajikistan, it was now possible to carry out both archival and ethnographic field research, which I enthusiastically embraced. My initial goal was to survey the diverse shrinescape of Tajikistan to provide the groundwork for future research by myself and others. I made my first research trip to Badakhshan, and I'm going to be talking about this area, in 2004 during my sabbatical in Tajikistan. And the areas I've done work all through here, up through Wakhan, and in the main valleys, Ishkoshim, Roshkala, Shugnan, and Roshan, and some in Vanj, but concentrating on this region, the capital of Badakhshan is right here in Khorog. In the course of visiting shrines and photographing shrinescapes and interviewing community elders, including descendants of Pirs, Khalifas, Qazis, and Mirs, as well as current Khalifas in the villages of Shugnan, Roshkala, Orushan, Bartang, Ishkoshim, Wakhan, and the capital of Khorog, I became aware of what I will call a pronounced nasab-mindedness, to borrow from Hodgson, expressed in the form of oral narratives, textualized local histories, and Persianate genealogical documentation, mainly of the 18th to 20th century, but there are some earlier ones as well, including the one I'll talk about today, that trace the Sayyid and Imami lines of descent of the Pirs, Khalifas, Qazis, and Mirs or Shahs to a series of missionary figures from Iran who are said to have arrived in Badakhshan in the 12th or in the 16th century, depending on the source. While the genealogies textualize lines of descent, and their descendants, including imams, the mazars and kadamgahs and ostans of foundational figures and their descendants are spread across the landscape of the Pamir. Here on the left, Shugnan in Tajik Badakhshan or Gorno Badakhshan, and on the right in Shugnan, the mazar, one of the foundational figures, Shah Malang, which I visited in 2008. But these are spread across the landscape of the Pamir in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and they reveal a trans-regional nexus that extends into northwest Pakistan and Tashqurgan in northwest China that I'm only just beginning to explore. Family members I interviewed were naturally very protective of the Persian manuscripts in their possession, especially nasab namas that had been passed down for generations. Elders repeatedly related stories to me of their fathers' or grandfathers' books and manuscripts having been carried off by Soviet officials, especially in the 1930s, never to be seen again. This photograph that you see here is not from Badakhshan, but it, I think, pretty strongly demonstrates what I'm talking about. I visited this shrine across the border from Tajikistan in Chorbak in Kyrgyzstan. And when I visited, the elders it told me that when I asked them about documents, told me about the renovation that had taken place and the reconstruction of the walls, which revealed what you're looking at. Sadly, in many hundreds of fragments that were hidden and rediscovered. So many families hid manuscripts, nasab namas, in the walls of their houses or buried them in the ground during the Soviet period. Persian, the lingua franca of the religious authorities and intellectuals of Badakhshan, is the language of the nasab namas, often interspersed with Arabic in the form of supplications, surahs, and hadiths. With the permission of their owners, I was able to take digital photographs of these privately held genealogical texts, at first with the sole intention of utilizing them in my research. As I became more deeply focused on the culture of genealogical documentary practice in Badakhshan and its inherent links with oral and textualized foundational narratives tracing the coming of Islam and or Ismailism, and their role in codifying the hereditary claims of Sayyid pedigree and legitimate leadership of the Ismaili community, as well as the early Sunni rulers of Badakhshan, I came to realize that the textual genre of genealogy as a source of local knowledge is largely overlooked by scholars in preference to literary and doctrinal works and historical works, and therefore vastly understudied. Second, given the conditions under which these fragile texts are currently stored, together with the precarious political situation along the long Afghan border between the Afghan and Tajik side, the Afghan side now occupied by the Taliban, they must be considered to be endangered manuscripts. Third, as I began my search for scholarship on genealogical history more broadly in the Persianate world, I found very little scholarship, aside from the important studies of Sufi silsilahs with Devin Duris's work as the exemplar, or the equally important work on the development of Talibid genealogies with Kazuo Morimoto's work on Sayyidology as an exemplar. There is the one edited volume by Sarah Brown, Bowen Savant, and Helena De Felipe, titled Genealogy and Knowledge in Muslim Societies, published in 2014, but it's firmly based in the Arab sphere. In other words, much of the scholarship on genealogy related to the Persian sphere has been published or is currently underway by those of us gathered in this symposium, which is why I believe that this gathering is such a unique opportunity for us to exchange ideas. In 2014, I submitted a proposal to the then recently established Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University, then under the acting directorship of Professor John Holden and his assistant director, Dr. Kevin Harris, to organize a collaborative digitalization project with the center, the Princeton University Library, and my home institution, the College of New Jersey, and the Institute of Humanities in Khorog, Badakhshan. And it's thanks to their support that I had the opportunity to jumpstart the planning phase of this project and prepare grant applications, which led to my award of a 3-year National Endowment of Humanities Collaborative Research Grant with my esteemed colleagues on this panel. The first phase of the project was the creation of the digital collection, which I'm about to show you briefly. And the second phase is our co-authored book project that's currently underway. I made a number of acknowledgements in my welcome, but I did not refer to so many people in Badakhshan that contributed to this project, and I cannot name them all, but I would like to especially acknowledge the hard work of Umid and Daniel, of course, and support of Dr. Hakim Kalendarov, the director of the Institute of Humanities in Khorog, Badakhshan, and the former director, the late Shodikhan Yusufbekov, the late peer of Persianate Shugnan, Sayed Shohi Kalon, and the honorable scholar Shahzada Mohammed Sherzod Shoyev, and in Dushanbe, the president of the Academy of Sciences, of which I am an honorary foreign member, Farhad Kodirovich Rahimov, and scholars Lola Dodkhodoyeva, Larisa Dodkhodoyeva, and Ranjbar Jafar. My inspiration for the digitalization project came from 4 path-breaking digital collections in Islamic studies: the Afghanistan Digital Library, founded by Robert McChesney, the Yemeni manuscript digital, wait, let me go one more. Yeah, the Yemeni Manuscript Digitization Initiative directed by David Hollenberg of the University of Oregon, the Zaidi Manuscript Tradition, a digital portal directed by Sabina Schmidtke of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton in partnership with the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and finally the Princeton Geniza project database directed by Marina Rostow at Princeton University. If you haven't visited their websites, I encourage you to do so. They're really remarkable collections. So I am going to, first I'll make a couple of remarks, then I'm going to share the digital collection. Needless to say, there were numerous challenges along the way, beginning with photographing and rephotographing, the rephotographing process often under difficult conditions, working with documents of different states of repair, balancing the need for clarity while maintaining the original integrity of the documents, collecting the metadata, which took multiple years of research trips to complete and included the organization and administration of metadata spreadsheets, for which I owe Daniel Beben a great debt, transcribing, translating interviews, transcribing the Persian documents, often laced with Arabic, for which I owe Umid Sherzod Shoyev a great debt, organizing the documents, as you will see in subcategories, and so on. But it is an ongoing project, and one that I hope to expand into Northwest Pakistan if the COVID and political situations allow it. So I'm going to no, that's not it. Why is it not showing up? I'm sorry, but I don't see.
Joanne, do you want me to pull it up?
Could you please?
Unshare your screen.
I don't know. It was on my desktop, but now it's not. Mhm. Isn't that strange?
Okay, there it
Thank
is.
you. Wonderful.
Feel free to tell me where to go.
Okay, so, oh, I can't control it?
I can, hang on one second.
It's not, okay. Okay. I still can't control it.
You're moving it right now.
Right, but
There.
okay, thank you very much. Sorry, so this is the digital PUL, the Badakhshan Genealogical Document Collection. And here you learn a bit about the collection. In terms of searching, you can limit the search by date or by any of these categories, author, and so on. You can also search by subject, or you can browse the collections, which gives you all the different subcategories that we have collected based on the various documents. Most of them are organized by the lineage founder, but some of them are actually, for example, Basid, which we have 4 items for, or we have a small collection of a wonderful, actually, nasab namas from Zibak in Afghanistan. And so just to show you one example of Shah Malang, so we can go to Shah Malang, and let's say we go to the Nasab Nama Sadat, which is a very narrow but quite wonderful document. And so here we have that we can control it, as you can in many of the digital sites, enlarging and so on. And the scroll holder that it contain, that it is was stored in, and below the metadata. Each of the documents has these options. And here we have the page just explaining who our sponsors are, which you've already heard about, and the project director, of course, and my collaborators. I'm happy to look at this in more detail if there are any questions later in the Q&A. So I'm going to return to my other. Can I just go to share screen again? And hopefully that will work. And that worked. Great. So it's not advancing though. Why is that?
Click one more time on your slides.
Nope. Should I stop share and try sharing again?
Yes, please. I'll bring your slides up right now. Give me 1 second.
Click here. There.
Okay. Oops,
Yep. I can bring mine back down. Go ahead. Share yours again.
just a second. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so,
They're not currently sharing, Joanne.
I'm not sharing. Oh dear. So where is my, why am I not sharing? I don't see my share option. Sorry about this. It's not being shared.
All right. I can bring your slide up and just ask me to go forward.
No, that's not gonna work.
Here, go to unshare.
It's not allowing me to
see
go
any.
to unshare. Yeah, I guess the problem is that I need to, yeah, I don't know, it's disappeared. The
Close out and reopen.
All right, I'm going to try sharing again. And I apologize for this, but is it showing now?
Yes.
Okay.
Start.
Okay, wonderful. And I apologize for that.
Okay.
Okay, I'm losing some time. I'm sorry about that. So I just want to also mention, of course, there's an urgent need to locate and preserve these privately held genealogies, especially in Afghan, Badakhshan. But given the current situation, of course, that unfortunately remains on hold. So a bit of background, Badakhshan is distinctive for its stunning mountains, mountainous terrain and village life in the valleys, its harsh climate and living conditions, and the strong adherence of the population to Nizari Ismailism in contrast to the majority Sunni population of Tajikistan. It is difficult to state with any certainty the date or circumstances of the spread of Ismailism by individual da'is into Badakhshan, or Islam for that matter, about which Daniel Beben has written extensively, and you'll hear it from him shortly. Oral narratives and local histories of the 18th to 20th century attribute the spread of Ismailism and or Islam to Badakhshan and specifically to Shugnan, to the missionary foundational figure, Shah Khamush, who according to local narratives and written local histories is believed to have migrated from Khorasan to Badakhshan in the 12th or the 16th century, depending on the source, along with three companions, Shah Malang, Shah Borhan Bali, and Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani, known as Shah Koshan, whose genealogy I'm going to discuss shortly. And this is the Mazar of Shah Koshan in Shah Chashma in Shugnan, Afghanistan. The Shahs of Shugnan trace their descent from Shah Khamush, whereas the Ismaili peers of Shugnan trace their descent through Shah Malang. And as you can see here, Shah Koshan, his daughter married the son of Shah Malang, and we go down the line and end up with, these are the ones in green are the peers. The genealogical tradition linked to Shah Koshan traces the lineage of the Sayyids of Derpidrud, Khasa, Simchiv, and Gund. Some of them served as Khalifas and Qazis between the 18th and the 20th centuries. Based on our examination of the corpus of 65 nasab nomas currently in our collection, the majority of them date between the 18th and 20th century. The textualization appears to have coincided with this period of the expansion and strengthening of the Ismaili Dawah in Badakhshan, particularly with the emigration of the 46th Nizari Ismaili Imam Hassan Ali Shah in the 1840s and his settlement in Bombay. And it was during this period that the socio-religious organization of Ismaili leadership took the form of peers and their khalifas appointed by the imam, and their status operated through familial lines of Sayyid Hussein descent. I will skip some of the material about the peers, having lost time before, but just to say that the 19th century was also an era of quite a bit of turmoil, as well as territorial transformation, which included the Afghan oppression of the Badakhshanis in the late 19th century, known as Zilmi Afghan, from 1883 to 1895, the religious persecution of Ismailis under the Bukharan Khanate, and the 1895 Palmyra Agreement between the British and the Russians, which delimited and demarcated the Badakhshan boundary as you see it here. This is the Panj River. It is amazingly close, the two borders, and of course we're contiguous in terms of culture and history until that time. I took this from the Afghan side looking to Tajikistan. So the Nasab Noma, according to the late historian Abu Sayyid Shah Humorov, who died in 1999 and was a descendant of Shah Koshan, the Nasab Noma a 3-meter long scroll dated 1000 AH or 1592 Common Era, was preserved by his family for over 400 years in this wooden scroll box, hidden in the wall of a house in the village of Khossa in Persianate. And the document appears to be written in 2 hands on a long vertical paper scroll. It is in poor condition, and Abu Said Shohomorov took black and white photographs of each section of the genealogy. Here you see the upper portion. Black and white photographs of each section, which his brother, Shobahor Shohomorov, generously shared and allowed me to photograph in 2008. I have not seen the original document, which the family keeps hidden. Before his death, Abu Said Shohomorov transcribed the genealogy from Persian and Arabic into Tajik Cyrillic, thus making it acceptable to his family and future descendants, as well as the present-day Ismaili community in Badakhshan that cannot read Persian. He prefaced his transcription, moreover, with his own Tajik language biographical introduction to Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani. So if we consider genealogical documentation as one of several ways of elite families of Badakhshan to historicize and transmit their past textually, a natural feature, of course, of the genealogical genre, Shohomorov's biography is yet another narrative layer in the construction of the discourse of genealogical knowledge among the Sayyid leadership of the Ismaili community. Genealogy writing, copying, and rewriting is thus a diachronic process. As Shohomorov states in his introduction, quote, Muhammad Isfahani, as a true Imamzada, always had his noble shajara with him and brought it to Shugnan. His grandchildren regularly copied it for centuries, and applying this practice, it has been preserved to our day, unquote. In other words, it is simply impossible to really identify at which stage of the genealogy's copyhood this particular one represents. So what I'm going to do now is turn to the content and the structure of the Nasab Nama, which I've divided into 10 sections. I'm not going to go into great detail, but rather just summarize it so you get a sense of the document. I'm going to actually show you the scroll so you get a sense of the length of this document. I'll let this scroll for a moment. And this is the one seal that remains legible, although it's not that easy to see, and you see the 2 others that are no longer readable. So the opening lines of the document praise Sayyid Amir Muhammad Isfahani's Sayyid status as a descendant of the Prophet, the Raisi Saadat al-Alim and Sharif of the 2 worlds, introduced also his esteemed son, Sayyid Wali. This section introduces Isfahani as a highly respected, well-recognized Sayyid and as a leader member of the Muslim community, the best of 2 pearls, pilgrim of 2 cities, pillar of Taha and Yasin verses, and so on. Oh, and I wanted to just point out that this section of the text, was in the last one, Arabic. This is a Persian section. This names the kunya of Muhammad Mustafa Abu Qasim, lists his birthplace, his death, his years of khilafat, his mother, wives, and children. The next section is in Persian, and this is the largest section by far, and it lists the Ithna Ashari Imams. It includes the dates of birth and death, the names of mothers, wives, and children, burial places, and the length and place of Khilafat. The next section in Arabic highlights the Ismaili Shi'i interpretation of the Quranic verse Al-Nur 24:35, that God first created the Nur of Muhammad. Ali's light is the light of the Prophet in guidance and leadership, and the Prophet and the albeit are of the same light. The Imams as successors, of course, of the Prophet are the inheritance of his ilm, the bearers of the light of God and his living proof on earth. And this section, the next section, actually, I don't have a slide. It's praise to Amir Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani and his son in Arabic. And then this is the next section, which is the Husainid lineage of Sayyid Amir Allah Isfahani through Zain al-Abidin, which is not that unusual, actually, in many of these nasab namas. And so I'm not going to go through that, but I also want to point out the seal, which was read by Abu Sayyid Shahomorov as that of Dawlat Shah ibn Shah Khattab of Shubnan, who is 6 generations before Shah Yusuf Ali Khan, who died in 1932, just placing Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani in the 17th century. The next section is the genealogy, the nasab of Muhammad from Adnan to Ismail to Nuh to Adam. And then we have the Shia Shahada. There is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God, and Ali is the Waliullah. Next section, is Persian text with Arabic. This is an interesting section because this is way at the bottom. The only thing after this is the date. And it's a declaration that Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani is a worthy Sayyid with the right to receive the payment of Khams as a member of the albeit. And so it's quite interesting, and I'll talk about that in my conclusion. And finally, the date. The date, again, it certainly reads very clearly as 1000 AH, 19 January 1592, although that date doesn't line up with the other seal, which of course may have been, that section may have been written at another time. But I'm wondering, and Daniel and I've talked about this, possibly to read the Arabic Aleph and the Persian Ya Khazar at 1100 Hijri, which would put it in the 17th century, although there's no Vav written between them. So what can the structure and content of this Nasab Nama tell us? It is an authorized Islamic document with a date, although that date is somewhat uncertain, bearing the seal of Dawlat Shah ibn Shah Khattab of Shubnan, as well as 2 other illegible seals, one that was likely to have been a Qazi. The author of the document and/or the scribe is knowledgeable in Arabic as well as in Persian, and the author well-versed in 12 Shia tradition and the Quran. The historical temporality of the document reaches back to the Prophet Muhammad, indeed back to Adam, thus creating an expansive sacred continuum from the Hijaz to Badakhshan. The Nasab Nama confirms the Sayyid pedigree and the pure and exalted status of Muhammad Isfahani and his son as members of the albeit. So let me conclude. The construction of genealogical claims in textual forms about Shah Koshan or Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani may be seen as a retroactive process of knowledge production, whereby the leading members of the Ismaili community of Badakhshan historicized the formation of their distinctive Islamicate communities, as well as their own Sayyid lineage that takes into account the migration, missionary activity, and the settlement of foundational figures. The biographical traditions textualized in the foundational narratives of local histories and in the built environment of shrines are malleable, diverse, and subject to transformation over time, a process certainly not unique to Badakhshan. When it comes to dating, exactitude with regard to genealogy sometimes proves to be a futile task, especially, or I should say, despite the impetus on the part of historians to do so. And in this case, we have a seal, which places the document in the 17th century and a written date of 1592, which could possibly be read as 1689, and of course the possibility that these were written, as many genealogies were at different times. The Nasab Nama scroll of Shokoshan, after all, also has a life history of its own, having been preserved by Shokoshan's descendants over a span of some 400 years and copied by various family members. Its structure and content, on the other hand, is clearly defined. Praise and blessings to the highly esteemed Sayyid Amir Muhammad Isfahani, distinguished member of the albeit, naming and the praise of Prophet Muhammad, naming of the Ithna Ashari Imams, the Shia Ismaili interpretation of Al-Nur, the praise to Isfahani and his son, the Husseinid lineage of Isfahani through Zainul Abidin, the nasab of Muhammad, the degree granting Isfahani the right to have the benefit of Hams, and finally the date of the document. So the genealogy thus identifies and sanctifies Sayyid Amir Muhammad Isfahani and his sons and his descendants in seeming perpetuity, but realistically, as long as the genealogy exists or is relevant. Abu Said Shah Humor's own recent introductory biography to his Taji transcription, which I couldn't go into due to time, it bridges the biographical instruction in the local accounts and the documentary form of the Nasab Nama preserved by his family, forming a kind of circular biographical frame with hagiographical elements that I examine in the longer version of the paper. So in conclusion, the genealogy of Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani and others I have studied from Badakhshan demonstrate the significance of considering local spaces in which individual agency, nasab-mindedness, directs the structure of knowing in the production of genealogical histories connecting the present and the past through Sayyid Ali descent. The culture of genealogical documentation resonates with other forms of local knowledge production, particularly oral narratives and textualized legendary traditions of sacred descent and conversion. The process of documentation, moreover, demonstrates the ways in which the functionality of genealogical writing influences its preservation and reconstruction over time. Badakhshanis of religious and political standing in the community and in relation to the imamate textualize their descent embedded in a discourse connected to a primordial past, connecting them to the prophet and to the foundation of the Ismaili Dawah. However perplexing it might appear in retrospect regarding confessional identity and or temporality. Thank you. And I apologize for going over my time. Okay. So let me catch my breath for a moment. And I would like to next introduce my colleague, Daniel Beben of Nazarbayev University, who will be speaking of genealogy as an artifact of Islamization.
Well, thank you, Joanne, for that paper and for your introduction. Would you mind turning off your screen so I can share mine?
Mm-hmm. Oops, okay, sorry, why is that? Yeah.
It's okay. All right. Can you all see my screen? My PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you again, and hello again to all of you. My paper here today will be following up on some of the themes that Joanne produced in her paper concerning the role of genealogy within the Ismaili tradition in Badakhshan. In my paper here, I'm not going to be looking at any specific genealogical document or tradition, but rather I'm going to be pursuing a more fundamental question here, which is why genealogy is significant in this context in the first place. And more particularly, what can genealogical documentation tell us about the process of Islamization, of the spread of the Ismaili tradition within Badakhshan, within the Pamirs, as Joanne alluded to towards the end of her talk. It's been well noted that genealogies within Badakhshan, like in many areas of Central Asia, invariably trace back to figures who are associated in some way with the process of Islamization, or more specifically with the spread of the Ismaili Dawah, the Ismaili tradition within the region. And there are many assumptions in scholarship over how that process took place, what actually was entailed in the spread of the Ismaili Dawah. Much of these assumptions are being based on data coming from the Ismaili sources themselves. One of the things that makes the Ismaili tradition unique in Islamic history is the fact that from a very early period, it offered a very concerted effort emphasizing conversion and what we might call missionary work or dawah work, which in many ways makes it unique among pre-modern Islamic communities. And produce a large body of literature, relatively large body of sources that discuss this process of how to conduct dawah work. Many of these have been now edited and published, translated by the Institute of Ismaili Studies and other places. And the sort of image of the spread of the dawah that comes from these sources is one that emphasizes conversion as a very rigorous intellectual process and a very intensive individual process. The sort of ideal model that's being presented in these sources is one in which an educated elite member of the Muslim community goes through this process of intensive search, of training and discipleship under a representative of the dawah, and then eventually enters the dawah himself or herself. In this, we also have at hand autobiographical conversion accounts of a number of Ismaili converts, such as the figure of Nasr al-Khusro himself, who is in many ways considered the founder of the Badakhshani Ismaili tradition, in which uphold this model that's presented of conversion, again, as a very sort of intensive intellectual and individual process. And it's a type of process that really, in many ways, accords well with Western Christian influence understandings of religious conversion, again, as a process that is driven by the book, through contact with the book, through a process of intellectual engagement, and one that is driven first and foremost by one of conviction, of changing, deepening one's faith. So much of the scholarship on the spread of the Ismaili Dawah has really taken these sources as offering not just a normative, but also a historical account of how Ismailism actually spread. Certainly, I think these sources can account for some instances of the historical spread of Ismailism when we look at certain individuals. But what I think they don't offer us is a workable model to explain how conversion to Ismailism would have occurred at a broader social level, particularly within a place like Badakhshan, as we'll see, which is until the 20th century was a predominantly non-literate society. And it's clear that however it happened, the process of conversion to Ismailism within these regions would have probably looked very different from what is described within the Dawah manuals. And what I want to argue in this paper here is that genealogy, the sub-tradition, was not something that was merely documenting the identity of the people who introduced the Dawah, as it's often assumed to be, but rather I want to argue, to make an argument for genealogy itself as a process that performed a formative constitutive role within this broader process of Islamization. If we take a look at a map of where sort of the historical trajectories of Ismaili communities, especially since the time of the Mongol conquest in the 13th century. One of the things that I think jumps out at us from this is that the places where Ismaili communities have persisted the longest, and in many cases where they persist down to the present day, is not in the major cultural or intellectual centers or political centers of the Islamic world. And interestingly, not even in the places where the imamate itself was based. And pretty much everywhere where the imamate was based prior to the 19th century, Ismailism eventually disappeared from those regions when the imamate itself moved on. Rather, it's in some of the places are in fact the most distant from where the imamate was based, and often very peripheral regions. Like, for example, along the margins of the Gangetic Plain within South Asia, or in the mountains of Afghanistan and Central Asia, which is what will concern me in this paper here. And there's a number of reasons why this is the case. I don't have time to go into them all here, but what I want to focus on particularly is if we look at the case of Central Asia and Afghanistan and Eastern Iran as well, within the broader Persianate sphere where these communities are based, we notice that there's often an association between Ismaili communities and highland mountainous regions. And the assumption, again, has often been that Ismaili communities tend to gravitate towards mountainous regions because these regions are relatively less accessible to outsiders and because they offer a degree of protection from persecution, which is, of course, a foremost concern for Ismailis as an often persecuted religious minority. The historical record offers many examples of massacres, of pogroms that have been launched against Ismaili communities throughout history. So this is certainly a major consideration. But what I would like to examine here is a possibility that there might be something more going on, that it's not simply the fact that Ismailis live in mountains because they are Ismailis, but rather could it also be the reverse, that people are Ismailis because they live in mountains? And I want to explain a little further what I mean by this. And I think it'd be helpful to look at some comparative research on this question. I'm thinking in particular the work of James Scott, who has conducted extensive research in the highlands of Southeast Asia, and developed this notion of, well, it did originate with him, it originated prior to him, but this notion of zomia as a sort of a highland area of refuge where communities coming from more lowland areas trying to escape trying to essentially escape from the taxation and oppression of the state, gravitate towards highland regions as a way of finding refuge. And it's very clear that if we look at earlier accounts of the Pamirs, even going back to pre-Islamic period, if we look at travel accounts from Buddhist travelers, for example, who traveled through this area, that many of these highland communities already lived in a state of tension with their lowland neighbors, had a very hostile relationship with the state and with neighboring political centers. So there's clearly, I think, a sort of social economic niche that these areas have played throughout history within the broader political ecology of Central Asia as being a place for people who do, again, exist in a sort of natural state of tension towards various states and empires that have ruled in this area. And so I think we need to think about the Pamirs and about the Ismaili tradition there as part of that broader historical continuum, as perhaps representing a sort of inter-Asian zomia, perhaps. Mountainous regions and the Pamirs in particular are often thought of as these sort of very isolated, remote regions that serve as a sort of human repository of ancient human cultures. The Pamirs in particular, since the 19th century, have been imagined by various European travelers and scholars, again, as sort of a human archive, in a way, of ancient Aryan cultures and traditions that are untouched by the outside world. What I think a lot more recent research has shown is, in fact, it was quite the opposite, that much of the population of the Pamirs has moved in and out of these mountainous regions over time. We have some recent large-scale genetic studies that I've referenced in my paper that have shown actually the population of the Pamirs has been very unstable over time. And in fact, consists largely of an admixture of populations that have migrated to there from lowland regions. And so it gives us a very different perspective on how we can understand this pattern of human settlement within the Pamirs and how to think about the role of religious conversion within that context. So again, the question is, how do we understand this process of religious conversion within such a context? Research by our own Devin DeWeese and others has really highlighted the fact that in many cases, especially within Central Asia, but elsewhere as well, Islamization is often associated with a process of community formation as well. And what I want to argue is that particularly within the Pamirs, that this association between conversion, Islamization on one hand, and community formation, even ethnic group formation is very pronounced in a way, largely because of this unstable process of human settlement and social formation that we see within the Pamirs. I think a productive framework for thinking about this process and for thinking about the role of Ismaili da'is and Islamizers within this framework can come from the work of the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins, who I recently learned has just very recently passed away a couple of weeks ago. And he developed this theory, what he calls the theory of the stranger king, which he first developed in the course of his field work in the Pacific Islands in the 1980s, and then in a very influential 2008 article, developed into a more general comparative framework. And it is a framework that, in its most basic form, suggests that when we look at the origin stories of many societies and political traditions around the world, they often begin the same way, with an account of a stranger or an outsider who arrives from abroad, who establishes kinship relations, marries into a local community, and thus establishes some sort of political or social domination or leadership within that society. And the argument is basically that structures of domination in many cases do not emerge organically within local societies, but rather are catalyzed by this infusion of life force coming from the outside. And that is this process can explain the formation of many different political, social, even religious developments throughout history. Now, the Pacific Islands might seem to be a far cry from the mountains of Badakhshan, but I argue in my paper that in many ways, when we look at the political ecology of this region, there are in fact a number of commonalities that we can see that suggest that a similar framework might be at work here that could help us to better understand the role of the Ismaili Dawa within this region. In particular, I want to call attention here to another aspect of Salim's argument in regards to the stranger king theory, which is that he's emphasizing the necessity of looking at how outsiders, strangers are interpreted by local societies according to their local cultural frameworks. This might seem like an obvious point, but oftentimes in conducting research, there is a tendency to privilege the account that outsiders tell about themselves, especially if they are coming from a more dominant, a more textualized tradition that is more accessible to researchers. And especially when we look at the role of Ismaili Da'is, who once again, we have a well-established literary tradition coming from the Ismaili tradition that offers a very normative understanding of the role of a Da'i, of his work in spreading the Dawah. And again, which has in many ways been privileged as a standard historical account. I think enough attention has not been paid to how such individuals are actually interpreted and understood according to local cultural frameworks that might help us understand the sort of social niche that these individuals inhabited for these local societies. We face a problem in this, of course, is that oftentimes the beginnings of this process of Islamization and long afterwards occurred outside of the light of history, if you will. I mean, we have simply nothing in terms of contemporary documents that might tell us really anything at all about how this process occurred in its initial phases. This is true in the Pamirs, it's true in many areas. And partially it's because in many cases, the coming of Islam to these regions also represents the introduction of a textual tradition for the first time, that many of these societies simply did not have native textual traditions prior to the arrival of Islam. And so oftentimes the initial accounts we have coming from these communities are not written down until many centuries after the events that they're describing. Nonetheless, I think if we look at these narratives, what I'm thinking of here is Islamization narratives, conversion accounts that tell us about how these communities came to become Muslim or Ismaili. They can tell us something about how these figures are perceived and interpreted, and which might in turn tell us something historically about how this process of Islamization actually unfolded. And notably, if we look at Islamization narratives coming from the Pamirs, I'm not going to go into detail of any specific narrative in my paper. I go into detail of a number of different examples in my paper. I'm just going to talk more generally about what they offer. Most notably, we don't find any record anywhere of this idea of the spread of Ismailism being associated with teaching, of instruction, of kind of reading from these Neo-Platonic treatises that are often associated with the Dawah. Rather, it's emphasized much more as a social process, essentially. And if we look at these narratives comparatively, all of them more or less have the same structure here. They begin, and I've broken it down into 5 stages. And I think this reflects a structure that we find more broadly in conversion narratives in Central Asia and elsewhere as well, but particularly within the Pamirs. It begins, of course, with the arrival of the missionary, of the Da'i, the Islamizer. There's often a sense of some sort of premonition within the local society, or even a member of the society who has called out for this individual to come in the system. And the second phase is that he arrives and finds at the local society that there's a tension present there, there's some sort of social division, and that there's often already a party that is either already Muslim or is is supportive of Islamization and is welcoming of the saint. And then there's a non-Muslim faction that's often represented by an oppressive, malevolent tyrant of some sort who's terrorizing the local people. The third stage is that the Islamizer engages in a contest with the tyrant and eventually defeats him, or in some cases converts him to the side of truth and justice. And then following that, the non-Muslim party converts to Islam, the society as whole is Islamized, and this catalyzes a broader reconciliation within society between these factions that were in tension, and results essentially in the establishment of a new moral community, following which the Islamizer invariably marries into the local community, typically a daughter or a sister of the defeated tyrant, and then establishes a sacred lineage that serves as sort of the cementing glue for this new community that emerges from this. So there's a very important role for kinship bonds here. Invariably, these narratives end with an account of a kinship tradition that emerges from this social conjunction, in which, again, sets the stage for an ongoing relationship between that kinship lineage and the local community. Now, what's interesting, in some cases, we have different versions of narratives associated with the same figure, coming from Ismaili communities and non-Ismaili communities within Badakhshan, and which I think reflect different understandings of the significance of Islamization. For example, the figure of Shah Hamoush that Joanne mentioned in her talk. We have a number of different narratives coming from Sunni sources that are associated with the ruling dynasty of Shignan, who was Sunni, even though the majority of their subjects were Ismaili. They themselves were a Sunni dynasty. We have one account coming from an early 20th century source, which follows much of the structure that I've outlined here, except when Shah Hamoush arrives in Shignan, he is welcomed by the local ruling family, and the problem he faces there is that their daughter is sick, is faced with an illness, and the local healers are not able to treat her. Shah Hamoush is able to miraculously cure her, and then of course marries her, and from then on establishes this local kingship tradition. And so what the Sunni sources are reflecting is a much greater degree of continuity between across the process of Islamization, essentially a sort of peaceful transfer of power, if you will. What we also find, though, are Ismaili versions of the same narrative about Shah Hamoush and about his conversion work, but which present a very different account of what I would say is step 3 of this structure of the actual contest, in which Shah Hamoush is not welcomed by the ruling family, but in fact arrives in Shignan and finds the local population being terrorized by a tyrannical fire-worshipping king, and then overthrows that ruler and kills him, and then goes on to marry the orphan daughter of the ruler. So what we see in the Ismaili versions, and we find other examples like this where we have a Sunni, or we might say non-Ismaili version, and Ismaili version, is that the Ismaili version oftentimes represents a much more pronounced understanding of the significance of Islamization as entailing essentially a much more radical reshaping of the social order, and an understanding of Islamization that is connected with perceptions of the establishment of social justice, of liberation from tyranny, and which I believe reflects a much more precarious and much more unsettled position of the Ismaili communities within Badakhshan. and one which, again, I think reflects an understanding of the social and political role of the peers, of the representatives of these lineages, that the role that they performed in the societies at the time when these narratives were being imagined and contextualized, who were often seen as inhabiting a role as mediators, as mediating between the local community and the state or outside forces, while also mediating disputes within the community. So I would suggest that the very prominent claim to Sayyid status that we see on the part of many of these individuals serves not only as a way of enforcing their claims to leadership within the community, but also as a way of enhancing their capacity to advocate on behalf of the community with outside constituencies. And to give one example here, we have a document coming from the late 17th century, 1673, of a descendant of a very renowned figure by name Sayyid Mossavar-Rahmani, who is often claimed as having been a disciple of Nazarbayev. And what's interesting about this, it is essentially an attestation document of his Sayyid status that is signed by several of the leading political officials of Balochstan and Qadis. Part of what makes this document interesting is we know that some of the rulers that are referenced in this document were in fact very hostile towards the Ismailis, and are actually recorded as having led massacres of Ismaili communities. So clearly there's an element of taqiyya being performed here as well that we can imagine many of these peers were employing, again, as a way of perhaps of advocating on behalf of their communities. I just want to briefly conclude with a few remarks about the role of these genealogical traditions within the broader social structure of the Ismailis, of the Pamirs. I think what makes these genealogical traditions unique is that they function within a society that otherwise we find very little evidence of any sort of genealogical structure or stratification among the Pamirs. There is no evidence for any sort of segmentary lineage system, or if you will, tribal system among the Pamirs in pre-modern times. In fact, if you look at the oral traditions of many families in the regions, especially those who are not coming from the families of the peers, in many cases, their family histories go back no more than 3 or 4 generations, and basically begin with an account of how they arrived there at their current location from somewhere else. We have a lot of evidence here, both from the oral traditions and from other sources of a large degree of internal mobility of people moving between valleys, or even coming from further different, from more distant locations and resettling within the Pamirs. Again, demonstrating a very unstable and very precarious society here, in which social structure and cohesion is very much based around the peers, who are very much serving as sort of the anchor of these very mobile and again, very precarious communities. So I would suggest here that the genealogy is not simply a form of documentation for understanding the identity of these individuals, but also can offer us a window into understanding how the process of Islamization and the spread of the Ismaili Dawah proceeded as a social process. So thank you very much for that. I will, how do I unshare my screen? Okay, and allow me now to introduce our next speaker of this panel, my colleague Umid Sherzalshayev of the Academy of Sciences of Tajikistan. He will be presenting a paper on genealogical history in Badakhshan and the nasab namas of Shah Malang. If I'm not understood.
Okay. Are my slides visible for you?
Yes.
Thank you. Hello everyone. My article consists of 3 parts. The first part is history of religion situation of Khorasan in 12th century. The second part, biography of Shah Malang, and the third part is textological study of the Nasabnama of Shah Malang. The Nasabnama tradition has played a very important role in the cultural life of the people of Badakhshan in the past centuries, beginning with the influx of Ismaili missionaries from Iran and Khorasan to Badakhshan, such as Sayyid Shah Malang, Sayyid Shah Kashan, Sayyid Shah Khamush, Shah Burhan Wali, and others. Each of these da'is introduced himself as a descendant of Sayyids and connected his family to this or that imam. The tradition lasted for more than 800 years, from the 12th century to the end of the 19th century, and was accepted by the rules and qazis of the time. Among these missionaries and da'is, the influence of Sayyid Shah Malang, Mir Sayyid Hassan Shah, Sayyid Shah Khamush, Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani, Shah Kashan, Sayyid Burhan Wali, Ghayasuddin Ali Isfahani, Sayyid Surab Wali, Faq Muhammad Parwazi, Sayyid Jalal Bukhari, Baba Ali Shah, Ibn Sayyid Arab Shah, Khaja Arab Khorasani was so great that their children guide the Ismaili community of Badakhshan for centuries. Mirza Sang Muhammad Badakhshi and Mirza Fazlal Bek Surkhafsar have mentioned this in their book Tarikh Badakhshan, History of Badakhshan. It is not a secret any longer that the Mirs of Shognan, the Sayyids, and the nobles of the Kohistan each recorded nasabnamas in their notebooks. From their ancestors from Khorasan up to the present day, and where they came from and where they lived in the mountains, what ranks and degrees, and had such as Shaykh and Mullah, and the leaders of the people, and education and guidance, and so on. And they have served, passed away, and left some descendants in these provinces, each of whom has followed in the footsteps of his forefathers, has become a leader among the people, either through government and administration, or as sheikhs, and they received the goodness and care and respect for people that still live among the people in Kohistan and Badakhshan. And each of them has a noble silsilah known by one name and title. For example, the Awlad al-Shah Khamush are the second generation from the Shah Kashan, the third generation are from Shah Malang, and the fourth generation are from Baba Omar Yomgi. And these families are very noble, and in the rest of these families are a few who consider themselves connected to the descendants of imams. They also are honored and respected among the people. According to the nasab namas of these da'is, in Badakhshan, the nasab of Sayyid Shah Malang is given as Imam Musa Kazem. The nasab of Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani Shah Kashan is given as Imam Zain al-Abidin. The nasab of Shah Khamush is given as Imam Musa Kazem. The nasab of Sayyid Surab Wali is given as Imam Musa Riza ibn Musa al-Kazim. The nasab of Sayyid Jalal Bukhari is given as Imam Ali Naqi. The nasab of Baba Omar Yomgi is given as Imam Muhammad Baqir. And the nasab of Baba Ali Shah ibn Arab Shah was given as Imam Hassan al-Askari. In his book, Professor Moyanshaw Nazarbayev wrote based on folk legends about Shah Malang, Shah Khamush, and Shah Burhan Wali, that these four dervishes were from Khorasan and came to Badakhshan to propagate the Ismaili faith and became the founders of the lineage of the Shahs and Pirs of Badakhshan. And by the end of the 19th century, the descendants of Shah Malang were the Ismaili Pirs, and the descendants of Shah Khamush were the rulers of Shogunate. Who was Shah Malang? Sayyid Shah Malang is one of the famous Ismaili da'is, and his descendants made a significant contribution to the development of scientific and religious life of the Ismailis of Badakhshan for more than 700 years. Shah Khaja ibn Salamat Shah, Sayyid Farrukh Shah, Sayyid Yusuf Ali Shah, and Muhammad Ali Shah were famous Ismaili Pirs. Shah Niyaz and Shah Ismail were the founders of painting and calligraphy, and Shahzad Muhammad was the founder of medicine and astronomy in Badakhshan. Historical sources contain exact information about when Sayyid Shah Malang came to Badakhshan from Khorasan. Modern historians have examined this event in various ways in their works. For example, Professor Bahadur Iskandarov assumes that these four calendars came to Badakhshan in 1581 during the rule of the Safavid to propagate the Shia Tariqa. However, this assumption of Bahadur Iskandarov is incorrect because the Safavid state of Iran in the 16th century was based on Ithna Ashari Shia Islam, not on the teaching of Ismailis. Throughout history, the descendants of Shah Malang have been Ismaili peers, and none of them has converted to the 12th Imami sect. Elsewhere in his book, Iskandarov writes that these brothers were sent to Badakhshan during the reign of Abbas I, who was a fierce missionary of the Ismailia. These thoughts of Iskandarov are also wrong, as Shah Abbas I was not a supporter of the Ismaili sect, but rather was a supporter of the Shia Ithna Ashari sect. More detailed information is provided by Professor Elbon Hojebekov in his monograph. He relies on the Tarikh Badakhshan of Mirza Sang Mohammad Badakhshi and Fazl Ali Bek Sorkhafsar for the biography of Shah Khamush. And he writes that the silsilah of the Shahs and Mirs of Shogunan, Shah Khamush was born in 1066 and died in 1136. Based on these he proposes that if these four dervishes came to Badakhshan at the same time, then their arrival took place in the 12th century after Nasr Khosrau. According to the Nasab Sayyid Shah Malang in Babrinsky's book, The Ismaili Sect, he was born in Sabzawar of Khorasan, was sent to Badakhshan by the order of the Ismaili Imams of the Alam period, entered Badakhshan via Shewa and settled in the village of Karunji. Shah Malang lived and died in Karunji village in the district of Shogunan in Badakhshan in present-day Afghanistan, and his tomb is also located there. The descendants of Shah Malang first lived in Karunji village in Afghanistan and then migrated to other regions of Badakhshan. There is a following story about the migration among people. The Shah of Shogunan, Qubat Khan, wanted Shah Malang's Murids to make a bay'at to Pir Shah Khamush because the Murid Shah Khamush had kinship relation with the Shahs of Shogunan. However, the father of Sayyid Farrukh Shah, Shah Partawi, who was a descendant of Shah Malang, rejected Shah Qubat Khan's request. Shah Qubat Khan could not reconcile with him in this case and under a pretext took his property and deported him and his son Sayyid Farrukh Shah, who was 12 years old at the time, to the Gond Valley. One of the inhabitants in Gond Valley Shekodan in sieged village, and he gave a plot of land to Shah Partawi there and built a house for him. At the time, Shah Partawi had two sons, Farrukh Shah and Shah Jahan. There are the children Shah Kalan, Shah Musa, Shah Ismail, and other sisters were born later. When the descendants of Sayyid Shah Malang live today in Karanji village of Shognan district in Afghanistan, Jomarj village of the Mahemai district of Afghanistan, and the villages of Darmarakh, Persianate, Sicht, Moon, Shetam, and Imam of Gond Valley, in Shognan district, in Tajik, Badakhshan, and in Khorog city. Textuological study of the Nasab Nama of Shah Malang. As mentioned in the past century, with the arrival of Ismail speaks from Khorasan, there was Nasab Nama writing tradition among the Ismailis of Badakhshan. Each peer who introduced himself as a descendant of this or that Imam compiled a Nasab Nama for his descendants that was confirmed by the rulers and qazis of the time. We also note that the Sayyids had great influence in Badakhshan for 700 years, and that they were the rulers, religious leaders, and founders of science, whose rank was equal to that of the rulers at the time. For example, one of Shah Malang Nasab Namas, BMP 28, states, these Sayyids are in all respects the masters of science, the Pirzadas, and the Padshahzadas. According to the research of Professor Joan Gross, she has today located more than 66 Nasab Namas of Sayyids preserved in private hands in Badakhshan, 12 copies of which belong to the descendants of Shah Malang. Unfortunately, during the early days of Soviet rule in the 1913, some of these documents were destroyed by the authorities. The Nasab Namas of Shah Malang were compiled in different forms. Some are in the form of an amulet, tomar, the size of no more than 1 or 2 meters. Some are written on a single sheet of paper or on several pages of a notebook. The oldest of the Nasab Namas are those compiled in the form of an amulet. But there are also early Nasab Namas of Shah Malang that are written in manuscript form. For example, there is the Nasab Nama Shah Mansur who is also a descendant of Shah Malang, the oldest of the nasab namas of Shah Malang from Badakhshan date back to the late 18th and 19th centuries. Although there are also copies that were written during the Soviet era. In conclusion, the tradition of written nasab namas in Badakhshan began with the arrival of Sayyids from Khorasan, Iran, to Badakhshan, and this family were born the religious leaders and the rulers of Badakhshan for more than 700 years. Second, the Sayyids are the first founders of Islam and Ismailism in Badakhshan. Third, the Sayyids are considered to be the first scientists of various fields of knowledge and artisanry in Badakhshan. Until that time, knowledge was unknown to people Badakhshan. Fourth, in past century, the first scholars to write risala ilmi, scholarly treatises in Badakhshan were all from Sayyid families. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omid.
Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Omid, for a wonderful presentation. And now we're going to, I know we are running a little bit late. I hope that you will stay for the discussion. And first of all, of course, for the discussant, Professor Devin DeWeese of Indiana University. So I will turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. These were all very fine, detailed papers. I can't attempt to match the coherence and focus of all of them in my comments here, but I want to take a look at a few issues that are shared in all of the papers. The first point I would make is that all of these papers have clearly profited from and contributed to the project that Joanne described, which I think wonderfully highlights the importance of digital technology for preserving the manuscript heritage of the Muslim world. Suffice it to say that we need many more projects of this sort. Joanne and her collaborators are to be congratulated for leading the way to a certain extent on this. But one can only lament, for example, that such a project was not undertaken in Xinjiang, for instance, before the horrors that are going on there right now. Another feature shared by the papers is a frequent context for genealogical presentations, not only in Badakhshan, namely the complex of shrine, genealogy, and sacred narrative. In the latter case, the narrative may involve Islamization, but it may simply be the story of a holy man or woman understood to be buried at the shrine and to be the central ancestral figure in the genealogy. We see this phenomenon clearly in the case of shrines, genealogical elaboration, and sacred narrative among the Hoja families of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, in the case of the so-called holy tribes of the Turkmens, and in the case of numerous shrines in Eastern Turkestan, to mention only Central Asian examples. In some cases, I think the genealogy itself takes the place of the narrative. The shrine embeds the family's key ancestor in a particular place, while the genealogy links the present to the past, without need for an explicit narrative explaining what particular ancestors did. As Joanne pointed out, the genealogy may also reach back in some cases to the time and place of the prophet, although narratives often allow the possibility of collapsing time and making the prophet, or Ali, come to some now Muslim land far from Mecca and Medina. In any case, the complex seems more natural than distinctive. If shrines usually mark a life that has come to an end and become places for the later burials of those whose lives were linked to the original shrine saint in some way, genealogical writing remembers those lives and structures their relationships in ways that complement their memorialization on or in the ground. Many, but not all genealogies, including most of those I think alluded to this morning, are prepared for the purpose of legitimation rather than simple documentation. And though they thus assume a broadly shared set of religious assumptions about who in the past is particularly holy and worthy of the role of ancestor, they're usually formulated for a more narrowly defined community, conceived of as bound by common descent, that seeks to assert its legitimacy and status within the larger framework. In some cases, as with descent from the prophet, the genealogy itself answers the question of why this particular group should be recognized as of particularly high status. In others, the narrative component becomes more important, and responsibility for Islamization in a particular region is one particularly common explanation of why an ancestor was special, and thus why his or her descendants ought to be tracked and honored. With regard to narratives of Islamization linked to genealogical presentations, Daniel's paper also makes the important point of looking for the social context and the social consequences of Islamization, rather than focusing on assumptions about the transmission of beliefs, doctrines, or knowledge as the key to Islamization. The genealogical genre arguably offers the clearest affirmation that Islamization involves the social, familial, or personal embodiment of Islam, rather than the teaching of Islam, though the same embodiment is certainly applicable as well to holy ancestors whose miracle was something other than bringing Islam. Umid's paper, however, on the other hand, highlights cases in which the role of teaching rather than of embodying is explicitly incorporated in the narrative. And this is something that Daniel alluded to as well. The chronological implications of genealogical presentations raised in all three papers deserve some further consideration, I think. One aspect of these temporal implications involves the generational distances conveyed in the genealogies, which often convey the sense that greater distance from the holy ancestor means the piling up of sanctity and status with each successive generation. To refer again to the complex noted earlier, the appeal of distance and multiplied generations may be mirrored in the length of the genealogical scrolls we find preserved, and is even paralleled in the context of the shrine by the enormous length of the graves of some ancestral saints. I'm reminded of a comment by the 14th century Sufi Alauddin Simnani, who contrasted Hadith scholarship, in which the fewer links to the prophet, the better, with the Sufi path, which was better illuminated, said Simnani, for the seeker by more and more generations of spiritual lights. He had in mind the Sufi silsilah, to be sure, but I think a similar notion of additional generations adding to the stock of barakah in a holy lineage, rather than dissipating it, often applies to our genealogical idiom as well. Another feature of the temporal imperative underlying the genealogical framework, which obviously depends on birth, maturation, childbearing, aging, and death, is the cumulative character of both genealogy and the genealogical genre. Some descent lines come to an end, of course, but genealogies, like the families they register, are meant to grow and need to be updated. This updating is evident in many genealogical context, but it somewhat complicates the historical task of judging when a particular genealogical tradition, with or without a narrative and or shrine complement, took shape. We can seldom ignore this complication and simply take our latest updating as an accurate rendering of a tradition set in stone centuries ago. But by the same token, we have to recognize that the updaters themselves were conscious of the greater authority and value of an old document. When the process of updating also overlaps with the process of textualization, as we've heard discussed in the session's papers, we must ask the same questions. Textualization, the writing down of information previously transmitted and preserved orally, implies a valorization of the textual form, but also a valorization of a text that is original or simply old. When and how should we trust the dates placed on our genealogical documents? A colleague recently sent me photos of a curious genealogical scroll filled with telltale misspellings and rather idiosyncratic claims of kinship among a wide range of Central Asian heroes, saints, and ancestors. It bore, alongside a host of apparent Qazi seals, the claim to have been completed in 574 of the Hijra, 1179. Though in this case, the date appeared to have been added in a different ink in a space where other now illegible numbers had been partly effaced, how should we approach a text with the date of this sort? There are multiple reasons to dismiss it as inauthentic. And in this particular case, I don't believe any of the text has roots that early. But if we assume that the text was actually copied in the 19th century, as seems likely, is there anything we can learn from that date, 574, about the genealogical environment of the 19th century? I don't have a specific answer to that question in this case yet. But my point is that we, as students of these texts, can valorize them without taking them at face value. I was also struck in Daniel's paper by the issue of renaming, with one of the heroes or villains in some cases in the study, Malik Jahan Shah, becoming Umar Yumgi. The difference in the roles of this figure is certainly important. Daniel notes that communities linking their own conversion to him make him a hostile figure in the narratives. But equally potent is simply the genealogical practice of renaming, re-identifying, and reclassifying in the service of Islamization. To say that seventh ancestor of yours, whom you call X, we know too, and his name was Z. That's a potentially powerful component of an inclusive strategy of Islamization, even though it's based on what we might argue is a brazen act of genealogical appropriation. More generally, we should consider two related issues that in principle affect all genealogical presentations, but in practice are usually addressed in quite different and separate ways. The first is the basic difference between tracing back or tracing forward, and the second is the difference between focusing on convergence and focusing on divergence. Most of the genealogies discussed in this first session involved tracing down or forward from a hallowed ancestor. And in theory, this process can include a great deal of generational expansion. In practice, however, such presentations are usually not interested in the full divergence of the family tree or in all the descendants of that hallowed ancestor. They tend to be interested in just one line or one limited group, us. This is generally true of the use of genealogies for legitimation, as in the many nasab namas explored here and in other contexts. They trace a lineage forward from the legitimizing, status-conferring ancestor, but usually only in one line, or very few lines. Similarly, other genealogical presentations may begin with me and look back, tracing parents and grandparents. These too will inevitably expand and diverge, more predictably indeed than genealogies traced forward, with a simple doubling of ancestors in each generation. But when legitimation is the goal, in most cases, not all ancestors are equal, and a limited number of prominent status-conferring lineages will be followed in full. Another way to reduce complexity when tracing back, of course, is to focus only on male ancestors, or female, for that matter, though the former tendency is far more common in the world we focus on. In any event, the gaps left in the earlier generations, whether through active ignoring or through lack of knowledge, are there to be filled in the course of later formulations. Daniel's paper discussed one apparent instance of inserting a useful character into the first available open position, and we would do well to consider how many of our genealogical texts reflect just such a pattern of filling some empty quarter in an earlier genealogy. When tracing in either direction, however, excuse me, even works that attempt to take stock of divergence with the multiplication of ancestors or descendants tend to incorporate implicit genealogies by referring to groups or families rather than individuals. In the work I've been exploring for this symposium, individuals are frequently identified not as the son or daughter of particular parents, but as among the descendants of a particular saintly ancestor, with no actual genealogy traced back to that ancestor, but with a lineage implied by reference to the collectivity of his descendants. The point is that this sort of, I'm not going to go into the details here, but the point is that this sort of genealogical shorthand may itself be employed in the service of legitimation. The final point to note involves the incorporation of extraneous materials into some genealogies, random narratives linked to figures in the genealogy, which have little to do with the genealogical structure or with legitimation, but which enrich the text and often record events unknown from standard historical sources. This is just one element in the social embeddedness of genealogical texts, but it is one that should remind us of the value and the importance of paying attention to genealogical framings of history. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Deb.
So Devin, you're going to be moderating. I see some hands up. So.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Now I'm to.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I saw first Monakia with the hand up. I may have missed some because I was looking at the wrong part of my screen. I'll get the hang of it.
Thank you. Thank you for these papers. I really enjoyed hearing the highlights again after reading them. And I actually have more than one question, and it's a little bit, I couldn't help but synthesize the papers just because there were so many overlaps and that you were talking about the same region and in many cases about the same figures. So like, just to start with my first question, I wanted to ask you if there was a way to think about, to think about these texts as objects, right? Because, and I wondered if, any of you could speak more about this, because I noticed that, there's scrolls, and Joanne showed us the boxes, and Daniel told us that these were not primarily literate societies up until the early 20th century. And Professor Mehmed Sherodeshov told us that they were also worn as amulets, as tomar. And so I was kind of wondering about the kind of materiality and the kind of labor, performative labor socially that these texts might have had. That's one question. The other question is really about women. I was interested because Joanne talked about the way in which mothers and wives are mentioned in genealogies, and that's very rare in my experience, except for very, very specific moments, largely when the androcentric lineage of a mother is being, or a grandmother is being called on, right? But to be taught, but wives and like that, it's just so rare. So, and I was also kind of struck with Daniel's reinscription of the kind of importance of kinship bonds. And also this idea that there is a whole category, right, of those who are dakhil nasab, within the nasab,
Yeah.
who receive the lineage through a maternal ancestor, and then there is descent from there, right? And you know, this goes back to like the much older Shi'i question, right? Of you know, somehow Ali inherits from Muhammad, and yet there's Fatima, right? So what we have also is a kind of idea of inheritance, like how we're supposed to understand inheritance and nasab, because nasab is patrilineal lineage usually. But then you have this idea of Ali inheriting from Muhammad, but it's not biological, right? And so I mean, I guess like I'll save the rest for later, but those are kind of my main.
Daniel, you want to start? Wonderful questions. So we could.
It is. Absolutely. I mean, I can speak to a couple of these points about the materiality. I mean, this is a really fascinating aspect. I mean, I think one of the things that makes it even more interesting in the post-Soviet context specifically is the fact that all these societies went through a forced script change, in the 1920s, 1930s. And there's a sort of mystique, if you will, around the Arabic script. Joanne can tell you more about this. Most of these families that we have been working with that maintain these documents, they can't even read them. And they often rely upon people like Joanne and I to explain to them what are in these documents that are very much treasured family heirlooms. But they don't know exactly what they say. So it's very interesting that there's it is really this notion of a sacredness around the text, even in cases where it might just be something very, very mundane. Some of these things, it might be like a lithograph reprint from something in India or something, but it's considered to have a sacred quality simply because of the Arabic text. This use of amulets and whatnot is very interesting. I know Professor Subtelny had a related question in the chat about the talismanic use of these and perhaps connections with the occult. My colleagues might be able to say more. It's unfortunate we have very little ethnographic evidence coming from before the Soviet period that can tell us about these things. And of course, Soviet scholars themselves had particular types of questions that they were interested in that don't always give us insight into these things. There certainly is a tradition there. I think a lot of it we perhaps can base upon our understanding from comparative research from other areas of Central Asia. But I think that certainly is, there's an actual tendency for scholars to look upon some of them as a text. And I think in order to really gain a sort of understanding of these sources, we have to look at this material aspect of it as well. Your question about gender and the role of women especially is very interesting. One of the things I highlight in my paper is one of the very frequent motifs that appear in a lot of these Islamization narratives is, again, this idea that oftentimes the sister, not even the daughter, but often the sister of one of these infidel tyrannical rulers turns out to be a secret disciple of the Islamizer, and is often kind of the first Muslim or the first Ismaili within the local society. One of the things I'd like to explore is whether we find this reflected elsewhere. I've encountered some versions of this from Buddhist stories, for example, but it'd be interesting. One of the things I want to explore more is if we find this motif repeated elsewhere in Islamic or maybe in other traditions. And another thing, I'm not sure if it directly relates to your point or not, but something I didn't really have time to go into with my presentation, but some of the key figures who appear in these narratives, and especially Nasr-Khusro, do not themselves have a lineage tradition within Badakhshan. In the case of Nasr-Khusro, there's some hints in the sources that there may have been a lineage tradition, associated with him in the past. The keepers of his shrine, who are Sunnis, actually do trace their matrilineal descent from him. They're very secretive about their traditions, so we don't really know much about it aside from that. But among the Ismailis, there are no lineage traditions associated with Nasr al-Husra. So oftentimes when he appears in these narrative traditions, it's a sort of marriage by proxy, kind of kinship by proxy, where he commissions one of his disciples to marry the sister or the daughter of the overthrown ruler, and then the lineage proceeds from that. So he performs a role as more of a kind of a father-in-law, perhaps. And I think what shows, something you talk about in your paper as well, is that kinship is not always understood strictly in terms of blood, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways in which kinship can be understood, in which the sort of bonds can be understood outside of a strictly genetic relationship. I will let my colleagues fill in on the rest here.
Yeah, well, let me comment on this business of materiality and sacrality. Absolutely, I mean, the nasab nomas are considered to be sacred. The paper itself, the ink itself. And so it's not only the container, most of them no longer have their containers, but quite a few have containers, and they can be wood, they could be metal, and oftentimes family histories or bits of history are in these boxes. There's definitely it's more than sentiment, I mean, there's an emotional aspect to it, as well as, the objects and what they represent for these families. I've thought about this actually, because there's, the scroll box, for example, or the stretched nasab nama between the two pieces of wood and so on. But I don't know if that's, particularly unique, to Badakhshan or Central Asia, but it's definitely noticeable in almost every household that I've seen these, which makes the idea of unearthing or, burial of these, objects, have even more of a sense of, it's actually, in a way becomes a kind of, shrine in of itself, in that knowledge of the fact that these things are within the wall, or in the ground. And of course, most of the things that got buried in the ground and were left for this length of time, were destroyed. Not all of them, but there's a definite, sense of sacrality that these genealogies and whatever material objects that go along with them. And I think that is tied to, what Devin was talking about, these interconnections, between the sort of built environment of shrines and the, the narratives and the, the genealogies. As far as the women go, and the representative of the women in genealogies, it's interesting. They do appear in quite a number of the genealogies, as mothers, as wives, but also if you look at the primal that big genealogical chart that I drew out based on a lot of the different nasab namas between these three foundational figures. Of course, this marriage between Shah Koshan's son and Jamalang's son and Shah Koshan's daughter. This comes up in the narrative, in the legendary narratives, and also in the local histories, and it fits quite nicely into the narrative that Daniel described, of the Islamization narrative, marriage playing that role. But also there was not marriage outside of these families. So that's another aspect of it, that the Sayyid families intermarried, and of course did not. In fact, it was very unusual if they would marry outside. So that's maybe another thing to think about. What else? I think we should probably go on to maybe another question.
Yeah, let me
Thank you, Mana. Really.
ask. Waleed Ziad has his hand up, if he's there still.
Can't hear you.
Here.
Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Now, yes.
There you are.
Okay, excellent. All right. So first of all, congratulations, not only on the presentations, but on the project, which is absolutely inspirational. So it was fabulous to hear about it. First is a very quick clarification question to Joanne. You mentioned Ithna Ashari Imami genealogy in the Nasabnama, and I was wondering whether is it something that I'm missing? Is this common to have an Ithna Ashari Imami genealogy within this tradition? The other broader question that I have is actually about, which Daniel, your presentation really made me think of, is about geographical or topographical shifts. So do we actually see in the genealogies any traces of the significance of the mountains as the Pamiri Ismaili tradition emerges? I'm reminded of the mountain shrines of the Shakta tradition, further down south, where you have these purportedly heterodox or outside traditions that then frame the safety of the mountains in terms of the sacredness of the highlands. And I guess I'll make a little aside comment here. I've been inadvertently, Daniel, collecting quite similar oral conversion narratives associated with the Gharq Shahars, the ruined cities across Indus Valley, Balochistan, and Hindu Kush, although the saint generally gets harassed by the tyrant in the process. So I would love to sort of compare and contrast the type of stories that you're collecting and recording.
So
No, let's do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Joe.
Okay, well, I'll comment on the Ithna Ashari, and it is not uncommon, in fact. It's quite common. I mean, I think that this particular Nasabnama really draws it out. I mean, that section of the document is really the largest section, and of course, there you do have, the whole, the mothers, the wives, and that isn't always in all the Nasabnamas, but quite a few of them. Now, the question, and I'm really interested to hear Florian's paper too, because he talks about, Zainul Abidin in his paper, but there are, and Omid mentioned this, but there are, a number of different figures. Zainul Abidin, of course, one of them in terms of the Ithna Asharis. The Zainul Abidin, Muhammad al-Bakr, and Musa al-Kazim, I would say is the most. But Zainul Abidin, I mean, I purposely showed that gumbaz, that's really on the side of the road, in Shubnan, of Zainul Abidin. So yes, I mean, it's not uncommon. And you could take the geographical question.
I mean, I just want to add something about the role of the Ithna Ashari imams here as well. I mean, I think sometimes these are misinterpreted, not by Joanne, but by previous scholars who have seen these as evidence of actual Ithna Ashari sentiment in the region. And oftentimes these appear in what are very explicitly Ismaili contexts, but rather the side lineage is being traced through the Ithna Ashari imams, even among quite explicitly Ismaili peers. I wonder if perhaps there is also a role of sort of intentionally avoiding claims of descent from the Ismaili imams that might somehow be seen as potentially threatening, or might be misinterpreted as advancing a claim to status of imamate itself, which of course would be very problematic. So I wonder if that might be part of the role of it as well, is that if you're going to claim a cited status, even as an Ismaili, it's going to be through one of the 12 imams, who of course, we also have to think about the broader role that many of the 12 imams play within even among the Sunni Sufi traditions in Central Asia, as their shrine traditions and whatnot, something Robert McChesney has written about. So it's not at all evident that this expresses 12 sentiment just because these figures appear. As far as the mountains, it's interesting. I mean, we find accounts, for example, in the stories about Shah Hormuzd, about how he was drawn to the natural beauty of the mountains, and there's certainly a sort of also sort of patriotism, I would say, that appears in some of these accounts of Badakhshan being a very beautiful place. We also find accounts that are quite explicitly about the natural dangers that are inherent in Badakhshan, you know, that refer to instances of natural disasters, of rock slides, of earthquakes. I mean, we find one Islamization narrative that is quite clearly describing an earthquake that occurs, and which sort of leads to a premonition of the need for Islamization as a way of kind of dealing with the crisis generated by this earthquake. So there's a lot of ways in which the natural environment shows up here. And I think another feature we see in some of these narratives where if it's not a human tyrant, sometimes it's a dragon or some other type of malevolent beast that is terrorizing a local community. And it's often associated with a story in many villages in Badakhshan, a particular rock formation or something that is said to have once been a dragon that was turned into stone by, you know, Imam Ali or something. So there's a lot of ways in which the natural environment shows up. And I would say displaying a great deal of ambiguity, you know, recognizing that this is a dangerous place in a lot of ways. And I think a place that people would not always necessarily choose as their first place to live, you know, if they had other options, because these are very precarious places, have very limited options in terms of agricultural production. I think that is reflected in some ways in the narrative, but it's something that needs to be explored further. And I'd love to talk with you further about doing some comparative work.
I just want to add one point, and that is that, and I think you know that I'm very interested in cave narratives, and that is very prominent in the narratives of Islamization, not just in Badakhshan, but in I wrote about in Sogd, you know, and that's something that also I wish to, you know, do more with that, because it's you know, there's a lot of comparative interesting material. I don't know if we can't see any Q&A. Maybe you can. I don't know why.
Shall I read? I don't see any other hands raised, but I do have a question from Maria Subtelny. If you'd like me to read it, can everyone see that, or should I read it?
I don't know. Yeah, can you read it, please?
Yeah, of course. She says, I was struck by the fact that in Professor Mehmet Shirzad Shayev's presentation, one of the nasab namas was in the form of an amulet. This raises the question about the role of the knowledge of occult practices, such as the use of talismans and healing, lettrism, Jafar, etc., in the legitimation of Sayyid families and their claims. This partly overlaps with what Anakia mentioned, and Daniel addressed it somewhat, but if there are other comments, responses, it'd be good to hear.
Yeah, I don't see Omed. He is here.
There he is.
Are the microphones on for Maria? Can she actually speak? I don't know.
I think Maria cannot. Well, I'm sure she can speak, but not in
Hi, good.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, here she is. Okay.
Oh,
I feel disembodied, but I don't think you can see me.
No, but we can hear you.
No. That's why I feel really.
Hello? Oh, you were muted.
Oh, I can actually show myself here.
Oh, great.
Wow, I think. There, okay.
Great to see you.
Nice to see you all. This is a wonderful panel. It's really very, very interesting. So I was just wondering, because of course, Jafar as-Sadiq is the, apart from Ali, of course, and the Husseini line are so important in legitimation via the occult knowledge of occult sciences. So I was wondering whether this, played an important role in an area like Badakhshan, formerly, or probably at the time of Islamization, a heavily Zoroastrian region. So I did notice some magic squares on some of the calligraphy.
Yeah.
And mention of healing. And also I noticed the text of the medicinal text that was shown. So, this is kind of a suppressed area of historical consideration. But it just seems to me this would be such a ripe area for considering it in both in Islamization and also in legitimization in Badakhshan.
Yes. Can you ask your question to Omed in Persian?
No, I'm afraid I couldn't. This is beyond my.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to set to actually express. But Omed, can you hear me, Ustad Omed?
Yes.
Here, okay. Maria Subtelny, یک سوال دارد درباره علم طبی در بدخشان در دستخط که شما نشان کردید.
I would say that درباره علوم غریبه.
یا غریبه. بله.
البته من دستنویس شاهزاده محمد ابن سیفرخشاه طب رساله طبی را پاره از آن را نشان دادم و این رساله طبی است. قسمت اول درباره خصوصیت شفایی رستنی های شفایی، دوم معادن در آنجا است و سوم خصوصیت شفایی حیوانات و پرنده ها در آنجا موجود است و شاهزاده محمد را در بدخشان پایه‌گذار طب خلقی می حسابند و او در این زمینه یک رساله مفصل را تالیف کردند و ما سال گذشته آن رساله را در زبان تاجیکی به خط سیریلیک ترجمه کردیم و به نشر رساندیم.
Okay.
بله.
So it's interesting, healing. It was not just healing of humans, but also healing of animals, which of course would have been something very important. Yeah.
And herbology is very well developed also in Badakhshan. And this group of intellectuals that are also, as Omed was saying, part of the sort of Said community, or those who were writing about this. I think there's quite a lot, actually. Omed published, two of the texts have been published, but in Tajik, in Tajik Cyrillic.
Yeah, okay.
Thank
you. That's great.
Thank you.
I think Mana has her hand up again.
Yes. Oh, and Yayoi. Well, now it's a circle. I'm not sure who was first, but Mana, go ahead.
You can, I'll wait until everyone who hasn't asked a question goes first.
Okay. All right. Very gracious. Then Yayoi, can you ask your question? There you go.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentations. You are carrying out a very wonderful project. And I would like to ask two questions to Professor Gross. The first one is about many other documents you showed in your slide. can you find any interesting fact from the other documents preserved with nasabnama? For example, do they reveal some religious or social activities or lives of Sayyids in Badakhshan at that time?
Okay.
This is my first question. And the second one is about your digital library. This is a very simple question. In your digital library, do you have a digitalized text too? If not, do you have plan to do it? Because if we can search by words or phrases, we can easily compare documents each other. It's possible that my document will correspond to any nasabnama in Badakhshan in point of format.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yes, that's a wonderful question. Well, so for the first one, yeah, there. I mean, I know, of course, you and Umid published, the very important documents in 2 volumes, but there are, yes, other documents, and some of them are in the form of letters. I mean, because the project was focused on genealogical history, I haven't really, I mean, I'd like to do something. For example, I have a collection of incredible, just Qazi documents, and court documents, that were, that somebody brought to me in a shoebox, and just I've scanned all of them, but I haven't had any time to really look at them. Also, you have I don't know what is in Persian, the receipts for donations, either going to the imam or, or coming to the peers, which, if you put those together, you can kind of weave together some idea of some local history in terms of whose names are there and so on. So those are things. There are also some miscellaneous kinds of writings that that I've collected as well. But I would say that the library of Umid probably, is the treasure chest, of Badakhshan. I mean, he really has a wonderful collection that he and his family, have inherited for many generations. But the second question is an important one, and I would love to be able to expand, the digital collection, or maybe there is some way to, to pull these the nasabnamas, of Central Asia, together. I mean, this is specifically, I see it brought more broadly as a Pamir's, project, hoping to maybe do something. I mean, there's a community in Tashqurgan, for example, with links. Peers went back and forth. At the same time, they're also going back and forth in areas of Afghanistan, but especially in Gilgit as well. So we have some documents, the Zibaki documents that I'm working on. It'll be a separate chapter in the book, is a perfect example of that. And in those, we see the links between not just peers, but Sufis and, and Ismailis and, peers and Khalifas in other regions. So, I mean, it's certainly something to think about, but, I'm hoping, I think all of us involved in the project, the 3 of us are hoping that this will inspire other projects. And especially, of course, the fact that, all of us are working on genealogical traditions, and especially those of us working in the non-state, context, have a lot to look at comparatively. So I appreciate that question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could also mention Umid has transcribed and edited a number of these documents, and I guess we're still discussing whether we might be able to include these in the book, but you know, certainly I think in the future this would be a very natural addition to the project, to actually include the full text of these. And you know, we have other texts coming from elsewhere that you have published, that Devin has published, and you know, at some point in the future, if we could build a comparative searchable database, you know, that
would be wonderful.
That'd be awesome. So yeah.
But you can you know, search. I mean, in the digital collection in Princeton Library, yeah. So in the book, I mean, you know, we're trying to figure out how we, you know, on the one hand, you can look at the original documents in the collection. But having the transcriptions, I think that we're probably going to have at least a selection of transcriptions, Persian, you know, the transcriptions of the main texts related to the themes that we cover in the book. Yeah.
Can I just make a point? I think this project, which is such a wonderful project, and the way you're presenting the metadata is really amazing. And it's probably on its way to ancestry.com. And I look forward to Henry Louis Gates of, I don't know whether you ever watched that program, but I'm an aficionado of having one of these people from Badakhshan on his show and going through all of the documents that are available. Anyway, sorry for being facetious, but it definitely is of the moment.
Thank you.
Thank
Mona, you want to question or comment?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to one. First of all, I just have a small question, and maybe it's not important, but I was struck with the Sayyid Muhammad something Esfahani, who becomes known as Shah Kashan.
Right.
Why Esfahan to Kashan was just my question. And is there anything significant in there? Like how one Nesba gets kind of traded for another in the lagab? That was just my small question. But the bigger question is maybe to do, and it's maybe specifically directed to Daniel. And this comes from my own kind of suspicion of using models, partly because of the kind of structuralist intellectual context that they come from. So, and this relates specifically to the point you make about Badakhshan as being this kind of refuge or safe haven from persecution. And I wonder then how we might explain the other large Ismaili communities being located in Gujarat and the mouth of the Indus area, which are not really, you can say, far from cultural and political centers, and certainly not far from, I mean, you know, Gujarat is one of the premier regions connected to the Indian Ocean in all ways, right? So like Surat, you know, all of the various ports, Cambay over time from the medieval period onward. And so I was just sort of like, that's not really an isolated place, right? It's a crossroads, in fact, of multiple currents. So, I mean, I don't discount the way in which certain narratives may position or understand Badakhshan as a refuge, but I wonder if that's only one of, like, I wonder if it kind of connects to what Professor Deweese was saying about valorizing without taking at face value. And also maybe more importantly, it goes to the larger question of needing to think about the local always in relation to the trans-regional or the more broad, you know, because one of the things I often see in South Asian studies is everything is special to India and nobody looks beyond the borders of India, you know, and so all of these pronouncements get made about Indo-Islamic culture and Indo-Persian that are common elsewhere also. And so I just wonder sort of how, I mean, I think this is going to be a larger question for us, right? Like how to reconcile the local and the trans-regional, but also specifically, how do you reconcile the Badakhshani narratives with the kind of locations that other large Ismaili communities are located?
Yeah, no, this is a really excellent question. Just go back to your very first question. I do wonder if these were actually two separate people at one point. I mean, it's highly conjectural, but I've been working on, a project looking at a 15th century Ismaili Dai by the name of Ghiyath-ad-Din Ali Isfahani. This Isfahani Nisba shows up. I just wonder if there is some connection there with this figure that perhaps got layered on or bundled somehow with a separate figure from Kashan. I mean, we've seen other examples of this where different Nisbas get kind of shifted around, but I think your more substantial question. So I think there's a couple things I would say here. First, part of the argument I'm making is that I think that the reason we find Ismaili communities in many places located in highlands, I think it's not because they're Ismailis, I think is the main point. It's not because they are going there seeking persecution, but rather because, or rather fleeing from persecution. It's rather because communities are already marginalized and precarious that are, for one reason or another, susceptible is a word that comes to mind, although perhaps that's not the best word, but that are open more to the presence of the Ismaili Da'is who are able to perform that sort of mediating role. So I'm not necessarily saying that there is a one-to-one correspondence of Ismailis in highland regions all across the world, but I think part of the reason why within Central Asia in particular, it's often found in these highland regions, again, it's not because Ismailis are fleeing there, but rather because communities that are already in tension with the state are naturally gravitating towards these da'is and these peers who are able to perform that role for them. What's going on in India is very interesting. And I would say if we look at a lot of the narratives coming from these communities in India, the Ghanans and other traditions, many of them offer the same type of structure of a figure who comes from outside, who marries into local community, who overthrows some type of tyrannical ruler. One thing I would say is that the current locations of these communities, it's not clear how long many of them have been there. There's a lot of evidence that the current location of many of these communities that are for the last 200 years or so been very heavily engaged in maritime trade have been basically concurrent with the British expansion into Western India. A lot of some of the research that has been done by Iqbal Attar, for example, and others suggests that actually some of these communities did originate in the mountains in Kashmir or in the upper areas of Sindh, and essentially over centuries migrated southward. So many of them do appear to have their origins in much more marginal places, but with the British expansion, found an opportunity there to migrate into much more open areas. But from what we've been able to tell from the communal narratives and the Ghanans, they don't appear to have originated in that area. So I think perhaps that same type of framework where there's a sort of this association between marginality and conversion to Ismailism may in fact apply to the South Asian case as well. I said may because I'm not a specialist in that region. I don't read any of the languages that these narratives are composed in. But from what I do know, some secondary research, I think it's possible that may apply in that case as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see further questions.
Okay.
Yeah, Joanne, I'm sorry.
No, I see like a 1 under the Q&A, but for some reason I can't get in. Was that
that's Maria's. That was
Maria's.
Maria's.
Oh, great. Okay. Oh, terrific. Okay. So, well, we've gone past our time, but I really appreciate all the questions that have been posed, and thank you, Devin, for a wonderful commentary that raised lots of different questions and comparative issues. I think that'll come up throughout the symposium. So I thank you. I look forward to tomorrow. We meet again in the lobby at 8:45, kind of getting ready and set to start promptly at 9 tomorrow again. And my apologies for, I tried my best. I knew that was going to be a glitch because it had to, I had to switch things, but it worked out in the end, and thanks for your patience. So see everyone tomorrow, bright and early. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mana, for your questions, and everyone else, Yayoi. And well, I'm sure we'll be able to continue these conversations over the course of the next 2 days, and hopefully after that too. So I'm going, I guess you just, leave the thing. Thank you. I think that the Pete is going to shut it.
Okay,
I'll end it right now.
thank you.